parenting's not perfect. It's messy as can be. And, when you're trying to strive for something that's perfection, it's just unattainable. And I think that's not the type of movement that I want to build. And that's not the type of movement that I want to create. I want to create space for people to show up authentically. And when you show up authentically, sometimes you don't always make the right choice. Sometimes you make the choice that felt reasonable that day, and then you have new information the next day, and you should be allowed to take in that new information and pivot.
I'm Naomi Hallum, a mother, long-term vegan, and someone who loves learning from others. I've gathered some of my favourite vegan parents, a mixture of advocates, activists, health professionals, chefs, and more, to talk about the benefits and misconceptions around vegan parenting, which are many. We'll also be talking about all the fun and not so fun stuff that we parents go through and how raising kids has shaped us. Whether you're curious about vegan parenting or just want to know where we get our protein, then this podcast is for you. It's a resource I wish I'd had as a first-time mom, but that you'll never have to be without. Welcome to Raising Gen V. Today's guest, Sadrah Schadel, is a dedicated mom of two and a passionate advocate for both animal rights and human rights. As a mother, Sadrah takes immense pride in educating her children about the important intersection between veganism and other social justice movements. Sadrah's entrepreneurial journey began when she co-founded No Evil Foods, a delicious and boldly branded range of plant-based proteins through which she sought to revolutionize the vegan food industry. While No Evil Foods faced significant challenges, largely due to misinformation spread by the meat and dairy industries, Sadrah's determination to promote plant-based eating remained unwavering. Now, as the marketing director at Generation Vegan, she continues her mission to promote a kinder, more sustainable future. Beyond her work, Sadrah's approach to raising her children reflects her belief in empathy, compassion, and the power of education to create a more just and inclusive world. Her story is one of perseverance and commitment to making a positive impact in both the food industry and in the hearts of future generations. It's a true honour to welcome Sadrah Schadel to the show today, so let's dive into my inspiring conversation with her. I hope you enjoy it. Hi, Sadrah. Thanks for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I'm glad. And you're getting a little break away from being a mom to come on the podcast today. How's that feel?
It's great. I always like when I can do some business travel. It's work, but it's a different kind of work, and it's a nice segmentation of my day-to-day. So I appreciate the opportunity.
So tell me about your kids. How many? What ages?
My human babies. We'll talk about those. I've got two. They're 5 and 8. They're going to be 6 and 9 in a couple of months. And that seems impossible for me to think that they're already as big as they are. But they're Amaya is the older one and Artie is the younger. And
I love those names.
Yeah. They're very lively little girls.
Tell me about veganism and where it came into your life.
So I was born in the early 80s and I have 2 older brothers and 1 younger. So it's late 70s, early to mid 80s is when we were all born. And I think my parents, they were really inspired by like the Back to the Land movement and the Diet for the Small Planet book specifically. And so they were really kind of counterculture in a lot of ways already. When I was growing up, it was a very simple life. I grew up in a country environment on a dirt road, and we had a lot of animals. We had sheep and chickens and goats and rabbits and guinea pigs and mice and pretty much anything.
Just as like companion animals?
Just as companions. We did eat the chickens' eggs at the time. But my mom just always loved sort of the cottage life of sheep and just having them in our pastures and
Oh,
just the
wow. I would
peaceful
have
sort of.
loved to have grown up with some sheep and goats
Yeah,
in my backyard.
they were great. And I would just go up to the barn all the time and just hang out with them, to spend time, and just like me and my goat, her name was Patience. I mean, I just have such like wonderful memories of these animals growing up. And they were very much a part of our family in so many ways. And so, they were thinking about that and how they could be as like minimally impactive on the environment, and how from a processed food standpoint, they really wanted to eat very simple foods. So, as a kid, I'm eating carob chips instead of chocolate chips. And like they went like full crunchy granola style. Part of that was also, just being vegetarian. And at those times, of course, the options were not anything like we've got today.
Right.
And so we belonged to a local food co-op, and we would go to the food co-op and we would get cases of tempeh. And I remember having like the tempeh freezer in our basement, because we would have to have a separate place to store all of the tempeh that we had to buy in bulk.
Oh gosh, that is wow.
Yeah. Yeah, you get the case of tempeh, you get the case of tofu, you get the fake and bacon, the tofu pups, like all these old school, very early innovations.
Wow, that is. I mean, I didn't even try tofu, I don't think, until like my mid-20s. And, until you know how to cook tofu, you're kind of like, this tastes of nothing.
Yeah.
But yeah, you've been doing that since the 80s.
Yeah, but so it's funny. So people talk about cultural food identities. And like for me, like vegetarian food is a cultural food identity for me. And when you look at the cultures that are using ingredients that might seem, exotic or foreign or different to us, if you look to those cultures about how to prepare foods, you're used to working with that ingredient, and you kind of know how to maximize it. And so I feel like I've really gotten the experience to have a familiarity with, it's just normal to me. It's natural. And so, I grew up, again, homeschooled, vegetarian, family of 6. And so in the country, 45 minutes to the nearest, big city. And so we did a lot of cooking at home. And so, having that understanding and know-how in the kitchen, I think, was really critical. And my parents, I ate sloppy joes growing up, and like, all of these kind of stick to your ribs country food. And my mom's family was actually dairy farmers. So she grew up, in the dairy farming, like real meat and potatoes world. And then she figured out how to sort of veganize those or vegetarianize those early on. But figuring out how to flavor and season food, I think, was really important to getting families interested in eating it. And just normalization, just figuring out like, this is just what we're having for dinner tonight. And it's just, this is how we eat. And then figuring out the language to take that out into the world. Because when you're home, it's a lot easier to control things, or at least to sort of create the optimal environment for things. But then when you're out in the world, that's when things can get a little tricky.
So your mum's parents were dairy farmers. Do you think growing up around cows had any bearing on her, I guess, not wanting to eat them?
I think at the time, I think it did. I think, she has really fond memories of specific cows that she sort of bonded with as a kid, that she has told me stories about. But again, like, she's not vegetarian anymore.
Yeah, so tell me about that. Yeah. So they raised you vegetarian, and at some point they both together, was it, decided to start eating meat and fish and all that?
I think the kids, my brothers in particular, started to have different social pressures. They started going to Boy Scouts and going to cookouts, and, we would be prepared and we'd bring our tofu pups, but then, they had to be othered, and no one wants to be othered, especially kids, right? And so I think that that's sort of where things began, when we became less internal and less home focused and started going, doing a lot more activities as we got older, and, interacting with a lot of different communities, because at that time in the homeschooled community, there was also a very high vegetarian community. And so there was a lot of intersection between those two groups. And so it was sort of easy to do social events because you had like-minded people. And so as we started to do, we started to go to public school, and we started to just do more activities outside of the home. I think that introduced different, not like we were isolated from other perspectives, but it definitely introduced just a different element to our worlds.
I mean, it's not easy in today's world to not stand out as a vegan in a social situation, but at least now there exist quite a lot of faux meat products, plant-based meat products rather, that look and taste exactly like the meat product that they were based upon. And so it is easier, I think, to fit in if you have access to those products. But yeah, to turn up, I guess, to a cookout in the 90s with tofu is probably going to really make you stand out.
Yes, yeah. And so it started slowly for them. I think, they started integrating some fish at home and cooking fish, and then, it went to chicken, and then it was sort of just a slippery slope from there. For probably 5, maybe 6 months, I started like sampling some of that food.
Right.
Because, everyone else in my house was doing it.
Was that strange?
It was totally weird. It was super strange. The taste, the texture, it just wasn't what I was into. And then psychologically, I just remember asking myself, I was like, my whole life, my parents have told me that we love animals, we don't eat them, that we take care of our animals before we take care of ourselves. And now they're saying it's fine. We eat animals now. And I was like, I couldn't fathom that. And so I remember going to my mom one day and I'm just like, Mom, I don't think I want to eat meat. Like, can I just be a vegetarian again? And she was like, of course you can. And both my parents have been like immensely supportive ever since.
Wow, that's amazing. It's similar to my story in a way. I wasn't raised vegetarian, but I was always raised to be kind to animals. And although we didn't have, sheep and goats at home as much as I would have loved that, I did grow up in a very rural farming community. And so, on my walk home from school, there were sheep in the fields, there were cows in the fields. And I would always try and rip up a bunch of grass and feed it to them over the fence. And my grandmother had ducks. And so I think, I had this sense of well, why are you telling me to be nice to these animals, but we're also eating them?
Yeah.
And that's why at 10 years old, I was just like, I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah, I think that age is really interesting, around 10, 11, because that's where I was when I sort of was able to vocalize for myself my desires in that area. I think for a lot of kids, it happens sooner. I think if they can make the connection, if they somehow come across the idea somewhere, or they have the cognitive ability to wonder about where their food comes from, they often kind of start to maybe not be able to vocalize it, but start to have increasing discomfort with the concept of it. It's make or break time in terms of how the parent or the caregiver responds to that kid.
Yeah, you're right. I'm sure a lot of parents, vegan or not, could probably relate to that and say that, maybe somewhere around that age is when my child or my children started questioning me about the food they eat and where it comes from. But the unfortunate thing is that most parents don't have the information to answer that question correctly. They might be able to say, well, it comes from a supermarket, it comes from a farm, it comes from X animal, but they might not understand where the nutrients originate from, that protein exists in plants, that calcium comes from plants, that we don't need to eat animals, that animals suffer in our industrialized farming system immensely, that eating animals is bad for the planet, all that stuff. They just know that it's normal and natural in today's society to eat animals. And so they will instinctively encourage it because that's what they know. And that's why I think, these conversations are really important, just to give other parents this information that they need to be able to answer in a more informed way, and then allow their children to make a more informed decision around what they eat at that pivotal moment when they're starting to become curious about food.
Yeah, I mean, the food conversations are critical. And I think that parents are very aware that, most parents, I think that high fructose corn syrup is not something they're super psyched to feed their kids.
Right.
They know
that
they know that sugar, is a leading cause of diabetes. They have a strong concept, and so they're already coaching and providing and making choices for their kids in terms of what they're buying and what they're serving their kids around those conversations. But then when it comes to the animal product aspects, I think that there's still so much unknown about that, from my perspective as a parent, for any topic for my kids, is if they're asking, they're old enough to receive the information.
Right.
And it's my job to figure out how to communicate that information in an age appropriate way for them.
Yeah.
And so, the kid's not going to come up and say well, they might why can't I have more sugar? Right. And so we have kind of, as parents, an understanding of why they shouldn't have more sugar, right?
Exactly.
And we're saying it's not good for you. It's, it can lead to cavities. You need to talk, you have the talking points. But I think it's important that parents also have those talking points for the day that their kid comes and says, what is a chicken wing? Where does that come from?
Yeah.
And that chicken over there, is it the same chicken that's over here? And I think parents don't have the language yet to figure that out. And also because they're not making those choices for themselves yet, it might feel dishonest.
Yes.
And I think parents always want to be truthful to their kids. And so it's like, how do you give them the language that's honest and age appropriate, but also not putting yourself in a situation where you look like a hypocrite in front of your kids as well.
Right.
And like, how do you balance all of that? And I think that that's like the early progression of how families change, because I think a lot of that, whether, you can saw it for my brothers in the opposite direction, but I think kids can also encourage their parents to start asking themselves the same questions.
Mm-hmm.
And then as they start to educate themselves and find the language, that helps the entire family evolve.
Let's go back to you and your parents. They decided to start eating meat again. You tried it, didn't love it, went back to being vegetarian. They were very supportive. So from there, how long till you became vegan, and what was the trigger point?
I was 15, 16. I discovered, probably maybe a little younger than that, I discovered punk rock music and started to meet other vegans and started to intersect other social justice movements, and started to kind of understand how oppression fit together. And so for me, that was kind of where things started to shift. I remember meeting another vegan who invited me to go to a demonstration. And like, I was the stereotypical girl in my, Doc Martens in front of McDonald's with my sign. And, I did the whole thing. And then I was like, I'm going to go vegan. And I did. And I went to college when I was 16. I started school early. So I entered university at 16 and I was vegan, and there were no options in the dining hall. And I was really grateful that I had a understanding of how to cook and prepare food for myself, because I had a hot plate in my dorm, and I would get frozen vegetables and cook rice and make vegetable stir fries with tofu. And I was able to sort of bypass the dining hall meal plans and figure out how to manipulate, the items that were there and come home and put them together in different ways. And I had a little cohort of girls that would come over to my dorm, and we'd all eat my food. And so I was, sharing my food with them, again, kind of sharing my culture and feeling more connected to the people that I met through that communication of food. That's like very much a love language for me. And so I was able to kind of create new relationships and build new connections through food in college. But I was vegan for several years, probably from 16 until maybe 22. And then I started to shift and I started to slip. I started to fall victim or fall prey to a lot of misinformation and disinformation from a lot of other areas. And so, like my parents, I started to think about where my food came from more. And you would think that I would be thinking about this for my whole lifetime, given how I was raised. But again, when it's sort of your normal, you don't question it in the same way that many meat eaters don't question why they're eating meat.
Right.
I never questioned why I'm vegetarian. I mean, except for that, when I stayed vegetarian, but it wasn't really like a recurring theme in my life. It was sort of like, this is just who I am. I'm vegetarian.
It's more instinctive. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just, this is what I do. It's easy and it's how I live my life. But then I started to think about, okay, the environment, and I started to really get into environmental activism and thinking about the impact of the environment and the local foods movement. And so then I'm like, okay, so maybe I get my produce locally. And then that was a slippery slope. And it was really interesting because it started with local sourcing for my produce. And I started thinking about, how can I choose organic produce instead of conventional? And maybe I can teach myself to grow my own food more so, or buy it from local farms and buy it from farmers markets because of the, the carbon footprint of food. And so I started to get into the local foods movement. And then I started to think about, okay, well, I'm vegan and I'm not eating eggs and I'm not eating cheese, but how far does it take me to get that food? And so maybe I should go to the local farmer and I should, eat their products instead, because I can go down and I can see the animals and I can walk by and kind of check out their conditions and see that they're cared for and loved. And I'm like, oh, maybe. And so I start thinking about this and I start making it okay for myself. And I start looking at the ingredients of some vegan products. And I was like, oh no, that's too many ingredients. It's got to have a short, so I'm getting all of these inputs and all of these messages. And even though I knew in my heart that I don't want to participate in this, and I know what happens to male chickens and I know what happens to female cows. And I know all of these things and I've stood up and I've spoken out about these, myself became more important than any of the animals. And so my own self-preservation and my own place in the world and how my individual choice is going to shift based on how I choose my food. And at that time, I was getting the wrong messages. And so I started incorporating cheese and eggs and, different dairy products back into my diet. And my sinuses were awful, but I was like, it's fine. It's from the raw milk from the local farm. No. And, I went through this process of adding things back in, and I just didn't feel good. And then I started to undo it. It was really starting my company. I started a plant-based meat company in 2014. And when I started to go out and meet people and try to convince them to try my vegan meat, we were just saying it was plant meat at the time. But when I started to say that, and they're like, well, why? Why should I eat plant meat? And then I started sort of telling the same story. And I was like, wait a second.
Here I am promoting veganism, but not living it.
Exactly. And then it was that moment again where I'm like, I am out of alignment with my values, and how do I realign myself?
Right.
And so it kind of took that moment where I slipped and I justified and I believed the lies and I believed the disinformation. And then I had to go back and be like, wait a second. No, all of that is not true. Like, it's powerful and it's very in your face, and it's very prominent and prevalent in the world, but that's not the way for me to live. And so I had to go back once I started to think about that and think about the actual real environmental impact of even local dairy, and starting to look at more broad systems thinking instead of local systems thinking. It's like act local, think global. I had dropped some of that and, starting to learn about agriculture more broadly in terms of just sustainable ag work in a permaculture and systems thinking sort of mindset and how everything is connected. That helped to link the pieces together for me. So I'm thinking about it environmentally. I'm thinking about it from a health perspective. I'm bringing back in the social justice movements and thinking about, brownfields and fence line communities and how all of these things that I feel inherently out of sync with are impacted by animal agriculture. And so once all of that kind of came back into focus, it was no turning back.
You are now a marketing director for a big global vegan organization. You're having incredible impacts. You're an amazing vegan advocate, and you're an amazing vegan parent. And you've done all these things without having this perfect journey. But I think that's why it's really important when people do turn away from veganism, have a bump in the road, make a mistake, waver. It's really important to give people grace and support them through that, because it's not the end for them. It's not the end of their vegan journey. It could just be the beginning of a much more important chapter in their vegan journey. And I think if we don't support people and we kind of kick them out the movement as soon as they say, I went back to eating eggs, then we never find out if they could become a vegan as impactful as yourself.
Nobody's perfect. And most people aren't, born vegan. Some people are, but everyone has an origin story. And I think that with any other pattern of change, I think you have to look for positive steps where you can find them. And so I think I'm a huge proponent of imperfect veganism or plant-based living. If your intention is good and you're working towards the outcome that is right for you and is best, I think that is the journey that we have to take. And it's everything is a spectrum and everything sort of slips, and it's just a natural, nothing's just a linear line where you start at point A and you end at point B, because that's not how humans evolve, and that's not how people operate. You're always taking in new information, and you're doing your best to synthesize that and make the right choices. But parenting's not perfect. It's messy as can be. And, when you're trying to strive for something that's perfection, it's just unattainable. And I think that's not the type of movement that I want to build. And that's not the type of movement that I want to create. I want to create space for people to show up authentically. And when you show up authentically, sometimes you don't always make the right choice. Sometimes you make the choice that felt reasonable that day, and then you have new information the next day, and you should be allowed to take in that new information and pivot.
Your children now, have they been raised vegan?
Yeah, my oldest, she was born right before the full reconnection to
veganization of yourself.
So we actually had backyard chickens that were rescue hens, but we were eating their eggs when she was first born. So she had some of their eggs, but we were already starting to peel things off from our food choices by the time she entered the world. So very, very early in her life, we stopped eating those eggs and started giving them back to our chickens, realizing that is much better for them.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people know that, but chickens actually in nature would eat their own unfertilized eggs for nutrients.
And everyone asked me, so like, well, so you're not eating eggs anymore. Are you eating your own? No. Then what are you doing with them?
What are you doing with them?
I'm scrambling them up in the morning and I am feeding them back to my hens, and it's, it's good for them and they love it.
Yeah, it's nature.
But yeah, so they more or less have been raised vegan. Our younger one has been vegan since birth. And, do they ever eat something that has dairy in it? Yeah, sure they do. Have they ever had a cupcake that has an egg in it? Yes, like they have. And, a lot of people are like, they've had it, but it's
really difficult to avoid
in certain
situations without, forcing them to become a social pariah.
Yeah.
And you have to make those decisions about, well, are they going to be more welcoming of this lifestyle when they get older? If I ban them from going to any birthday parties where there's dairy served, or are they maybe going to be have more positive kind of interactions with veganism if I don't allow it to impact them negatively?
That's exactly it. I'm trying to keep it positive for them because I don't want to be their bully in this. And I mean, I don't want to be anybody's bully, but I certainly don't want to be a bully to my kids. And so they understand very, very clearly why I make the choices I make, why I think it's the correct choice and the best healthy, health choice for them. I talk to them about, the different systems that it interconnects with in an age appropriate way. I give them all of the information. And then if a situation, and I try to be prepared. So with the birthday party situation, I try to, a lot of parents are actually super conscious these days, and they'll say, like, are there any dietary, gluten-free is so big.
Yeah,
and
it's good actually. Yeah.
There's a lot more.
They provide an opportunity to bring your own food or to have something brought in for you.
Yeah, so there's a lot more sort of awareness more broadly. So there's either an option already there for the kids, or if we know we've got a party coming up, I make sure that we have something that they can enjoy. It might not be the same thing that all the other kids are eating, but the kids just want to participate. Again, it's that sense of belonging. And so, I try my best to do that. Are there times when we've shown up and the kids are like, oh, I really want a cupcake? And it's a really hard internal struggle for me because I don't want to say like, yes, it's fine because we're celebrating. Like, I don't want to communicate that celebration means like suffering and that we can celebrate suffering. And like, that's not really my mindset that I want to relay to my kids. So I try to tell them like, that cupcake, has butter and eggs in it. We've talked about this. It is your choice whether you would like to have the cupcake or, I'm not going to be eating it. And mom would choose not to, but I want you to make the decision for yourself. And most of the time they choose to not have the cupcake. Sometimes they really want it. And, and I don't want to be like, you shouldn't have that cupcake. I don't want
Or you can't. Or
you can't. Or,
it's really not. It's not a great way to give them a positive experience of veganism. And that's what it should be. It should be about love and positivity.
Yeah, but at such a young age that they're able to sort of ask themselves that question and check in with themselves. I think that's the lesson there. Like, they're not always going to make the perfect choice or the choice that I want them to make, but I think the exercise is critical, where we're reminding them of our values, we're reminding them why we might make a certain choice, and then we're saying it is your body and is your choice. You know the same information I know now. I need you to come up with this on your own. And it's empowering for them to feel that. And a lot of the times, and also to feel the support when they know that they're not doing something that I would like them to do, but they still feel like they're loved. And, I think that's the message.
I think there's promise, isn't there, that the world would be more accepting of vegans in 5, 10, 15 years' time, because I certainly know growing up, I didn't have the social consciousness or the understanding of different social justice issues that we generally have as a society today. Discussions about trans rights, gay rights, Black lives. These were not sort of talking points when I was growing up, but they very much are now. Now we don't make as many presumptions about people. We're much more curious and much more accepting generally. We've still got a long way to go, of course. So I do hope we get there with veganism, because I think, right now vegans are generally seen as outliers, seen as extremists, seen as a bit odd.
Yeah.
Right? And we're all a bit odd.
Yeah.
But I think as a progressive society, it's only it would only make sense that we continue to evolve and become more compassionate, sensitive, conscious, thoughtful people. And in line with that, that a higher percentage of the population will become vegan. And at least those that aren't will see veganism as more of a normalized, vital social justice movement, something that's necessary for us to keep evolving as a species.
Yeah. And I think too, like, I'm already starting to see my kids be able to pull together the connections that took me so long to make. Because I talked to them about, the LGBT community, and I talked to them about the Black Lives Movement, and I talked to them about all of these other social justice adjacent movements, but they're not really adjacent. They're all one and the same. And so you want to have these conversations with our kids, and we're reading books, and, we're talking about, systems of oppression, and they can say to me like, oh, that's like when, animals are kept in cages, and, that species, we talk about speciesism. It's just a different part of our language that, exists more broadly in our home than has in generations prior. And I think that there's more and more families, people are saying like, why are there so many kids who are coming out so much younger these days? And it's not really that there's any more gay kids than there ever have been before. Yeah. There's always been gay kids. There's always been trans people. Yeah. But they're feeling more allowed to live
they're not as
their
afraid
lives.
to come
they're not
out.
as afraid. They have the language. They have the tools. And I think that in very different but somewhat similar ways, we're creating a community that's welcoming for everybody in the same way, and helping people make those connections.
Right. For any parent who may be thinking of starting a family or already has children, do you have like a general message for parents who are curious about bringing this philosophy into the raising of their family?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think if you're thinking about it, then you're on the right track. And I think it starts with education, and then figuring out how to get yourself comfortable with the subject and the topic first. And so if you're thinking like, all right, I want to sort of eke my family or nudge my family in this direction, educate yourself, meet some other people who are living this lifestyle. There's so many groups on the internet that you can go out to and find meal plans and recipes and different reasons. And I think when you're comfortable with the topic, then you're much more confident and capable of changing minds as well. And so starting small, educating yourself so that you're comfortable with it, and then trying it out for just a day. And don't make a big deal out of it. Like, I don't think it needs to be this whole thing like, we're vegan now. Like, you don't have to have like a huge party and tell everyone that you know, because that also like it makes it difficult for you to have to have imperfection, right? So I think that you can just say like, hey, we're going to try to eat less. And I think that is a huge positive step. Yeah. And so once you start to eat less, cheese is always super hard for people, right? I know you said it was hard for you. I used to smoke. I don't know if you ever smoked, but
well, don't tell my parents, but I definitely tried a few cigarettes.
Yeah. So I smoked for a long time. And when I was smoking, completely natural for me, had no, understanding of how it impacted anyone else in the room, didn't care, really addicted to it, made me feel good, wanted to keep doing it. And eventually, as I got further and further away from smoking, the more disgusting I realized that it was. And I look back at it, I'm like, God, I cannot imagine I ever did that. And now when I'm around cigarettes, my nasals get all congested and everything just feels bad. It was like that with cheese for me too. Once I got away from it, I now look back and I'm like, I can't believe I ever ate that. Like now. And so I think like once it becomes not your normal anymore and you slowly kind of peel it away and make more frequent positive choices, the easier that it becomes long term, and the more distance that you get from living the way you used to live, the more foreign that life becomes to you. And I think that that's it. You no longer look at those things as food. And so if you slowly start incorporating different ingredients, and kids don't like new things. They don't like new foods. So you don't want to be like, we're going to try this new cheese made from plants. So kids going to be like, what? Just make them the food that they already love. Swap out one ingredient in that recipe and slowly start to like infiltrate their meal times with more plant-based options. Yeah. Because that's what you're doing anyway. You're trying to sneak in the broccoli by blending it in the pasta sauce or whatever. Just go a little bit further.
And it's true what you say, like being a vegan is not hard, but the transition can be.
Transition's rough.
And if you don't feel like you are capable of transitioning overnight, which is the case for definitely most people, if not all, then start to lean into it. start to switch out. And there's a lot of programs out there where you can get guidance on how to transition gradually. I know, Generation Vegan supports that. There's OMD for the Planet, which is, switching to 1 meal a day, plant-based for planetary reasons. There's Meat-Free Mondays. There's loads of different, We Are the Weather. I think that's like until 5, have 2 of your meals plant-based. There's lots of ways you can do it. And I think the more you do it, the easier it becomes until, as you say, it becomes natural and kind of inconceivable to eat any other way.
Yeah.
And wow, what an abundance of amazing foods there are out there that are plant-based that most meat eaters will not have tried yet, but are going to absolutely love when they do.
I don't think that you have to think about I have to completely change the way that I eat. I think start small. Think about the recipes that you already love today. What's your kid's favorite recipe? What's your kid's favorite food? Figure out how to just switch that one food and make them love that. People are like, oh, I could never eat vegan food. I've never had vegan food. It's like, you've had French fries. You've had bread. You have had vegan food.
Yeah, you have
so
pasta
try to remove the stigma around it and just give yourself permission to have some fun.
Well, thank you so much for chatting to me. It was really interesting hearing about how you were brought up and how you've influenced your children to be good humans.
Oh, I try every day. Time will tell.
Yeah, we'll wait and see. But I think that's what we can do as parents is do our best.
For sure.
Thank you for listening to Raising Gen V. If you'd like to hear more, please subscribe to this channel. You can also watch videos from this podcast via our YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook channels, details of which can be found in the description. Comments, likes, reviews, and ratings mean the world to my team and I, as do suggestions for future podcast guests and topics for discussion. Remember, children learn more from who you are than from what you teach. So make conscious choices, be curious about the world, be infinitely compassionate, and pave the way for a better tomorrow. See you next time.